She had 43 cents in her coat pocket, no shoes that fit, and a bruise shaped like a handprint on the side of her neck that she'd been hiding for 3 days. The blizzard hit Coldwater Gulch at sundown, and by the time Maeve Holloway understood she had nowhere to go, the temperature had already dropped below what her body could fight. Doors slammed, windows went dark. The whole town folded itself inward like a fist, and she stood in the middle of the main street, alone, while the snow buried her footprints one by one, as if the world was already trying to forget she existed. If you've ever been left with nothing and told to survive anyway, this story is for you. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow started as a whisper. That's the thing about mountain blizzards in the high country of the American West. They don't announce themselves like storms do in the flatlands. There's no slow build, no dark curtain rolling in from the horizon with enough warning to give a person time to think. One moment the sky is gray and still and heavy, the way old wool feels when it's been soaked through. And then the wind turns, and the whole world goes white, and everything you thought you understood about your situation gets revised downward. Maeve Holloway understood her situation the way a person understands a verdict. Not gradually, all at once. She'd arrived in Coldwater Gulch 3 days earlier on the back of a freight wagon, tucked between 2 crates of dried goods and a roll of fence wire, having paid the driver $4 and a pair of silver earrings she'd been wearing since her 16th birthday. She hadn't eaten in 2 days before that. She'd walked 11 miles in the wrong shoes before flagging down that wagon on a switchback road above the canyon, and by the time she climbed down in front of the town's only general store, her left heel was bleeding through her stocking. She hadn't cried about any of it. Crying was something she'd trained herself out of, the same way you train yourself out of any habit that costs more than it gives. Coldwater Gulch was not a welcoming place even in good weather. It was a mining town, the kind that had been born ugly and grown uglier, a single main street of warped wooden buildings pressed together like teeth in a crowded jaw, a population of maybe 300 men who came for the silver and stayed because they'd spent all their money and had nowhere else to be. There were a handful of women in town, mostly the wives of the foreman who ran the Caldwell mining operation up the ridge, and 2 who worked the saloon, and they all regarded Maeve with the specific suspicion reserved for a woman traveling alone with no visible reason and no visible means. She'd tried to find work immediately. That had been the plan, such as it was. She had a plan the way a drowning person has a plan. Desperation dressed up as strategy. The first place she tried was the Coldwater Hotel, which was neither cold nor warm, but simply dim and smelled of pipe smoke and mildew. The man at the desk had a gray mustache and eyes that moved over her in a way she recognized, and had learned to keep her face still through. "Looking for work?" she said. "Cleaning, cooking, laundry, whatever you need." He'd studied her for a long moment. "You running from something?" "I'm looking for work," she said again. He told her he didn't have anything. She tried the saloon next, because by that point her heel had soaked through a second stocking and she'd been walking for 3 hours, and she needed to sit down more than she needed dignity. The woman who ran it, a large, practical-looking woman named Bess, who wore her hair up with what appeared to be a fork stuck through it, had been marginally kinder. "I've got a girl already," Bess said, not unkindly, "and I can't afford to. But sit down a minute." She'd brought Maeve a bowl of something, a stew, thick and hot, and Maeve had eaten it with her eyes cast down because she hadn't wanted Bess to see how badly she needed it. After, Bess had given her a room for 2 nights in exchange for help in the kitchen, and Maeve had slept like someone dropped from a height, face down on a narrow mattress, while the town creaked and settled around her. 2 nights. She'd been in town for 3 days, and on the 3rd day Bess had come to her room in the morning with an apologetic look that Maeve recognized before the woman even opened her mouth. "My girl's husband came back from Denver," Bess said. "She's back and I can't—" "It's fine," Maeve said. "There might be work up at the Caldwell camp." "I'll ask," Maeve said. She'd already known she wouldn't. The Caldwell camp was where men went to break their backs for a company that would forget their names. It was not a place for a woman to walk into alone asking questions. She'd spent the 3rd day trying every other option. The minister's wife, the assay office, a laundress on the south end of town who already had a girl, an older man who ran a leather shop and had a sign that said, "Help Wanted" in the window, which turned out to mean a man to lift crates, not a woman of any description. By 4 o'clock, she had 43 cents, no prospects, and a coat that was warm enough for autumn in a valley, but was not warm enough for what was coming down the mountain. She knew what was coming because she'd grown up watching weather, the same way children who grow up near water learn to read currents. Her father had been a man who noticed things about the sky, pressure changes, the behavior of birds, the particular quality of silence that precedes violence, meteorological or otherwise. He'd been a difficult man in most respects, but he'd taught her that, and what she saw above Coldwater Gulch at 4:30 in the afternoon was a sky that intended harm. She should have left that morning. She knew that now. She should have walked back down the switchback road and taken her chances on the lower valley, snow or not. But she'd been trying to solve the problem: food, money, work. And she'd waited too long. And now the snow was coming sideways and the temperature had dropped so fast it felt like something physical, like a hand pressing against her chest. The main street emptied in under 20 minutes. She watched it happen from the doorway of the assay office, which was locked but provided a narrow overhang and the illusion of shelter. One by one, the horses were led away. One by one, the doors closed. A group of miners who'd been arguing about something outside the saloon took their argument inside. The last person she saw was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, who ran from one building to another with his coat pulled over his head, and even he didn't look at her. The wind found the gaps in her coat with a kind of efficiency that felt personal. She pressed herself against the door and watched the snow. It was accumulating fast, already 2-3 inches on the boardwalk planks, and it showed no sign of slowing. Her feet had gone from painful to numb, which she understood was not an improvement. She tried the assay office door again, locked. She made it across to the general store, head down, one arm up to block the wind. The door was locked. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again harder, and someone inside shouted something she couldn't make out through the glass, but the tone was clear enough. She stood in front of the general store and tried to think. This was the point at which a sensible assessment of the situation would have produced genuine fear. And maybe she was afraid. Maybe some part of her understood what exposure did to a body, and understood she was already in it. But the fear didn't feel like panic. It felt like something colder and quieter, a kind of arithmetic. She was figuring out how bad it was. Her heel had gone numb along with the rest of her feet. The bruise on her neck ached in the cold. She had 43 cents. She had no one in Coldwater Gulch who owed her anything, no one in the whole of the territory who knew where she was. And if the storm was what the sky suggested it was, she had perhaps an hour before the cold crossed the line from serious to fatal. She started walking because standing still seemed worse. She didn't know where she was walking to. There wasn't anywhere. She made it to the end of the main street, maybe 300 feet, and then she had to stop because the wind had doubled in the last 10 minutes, and walking into it directly was like pushing against something solid. She turned her back to it and stood with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes mostly closed. She thought, with a detachment that surprised her, that this was a strange way to die. She'd imagined worse. There had been nights in the house on Clearwater Road, in the months before she'd left, when she'd lain awake in the dark and tried to map out the topography of her own future, and what she'd seen had been worse than this. Slower, more deliberate. This at least was just weather. Nobody meant it. She didn't hear him coming. The snow swallowed sound the way deep water swallows light, completely, without hesitation. And so the first she knew of him was a shadow in her peripheral vision, large and slow-moving, coming from the alley between the livery stable and a building she hadn't been inside. She turned toward it by instinct, the way a person moves toward any point of difference when everything else is white. He was a tall man. That was the first thing. Tall and broad in a way that wasn't bulk, but rather solidity, the kind of build that comes from years of work in conditions that don't tolerate softness. He wore a coat of heavy canvas and fur and a hat pulled low, and his face, what she could see of it, was weathered and dark-bearded and still. He was carrying something over one shoulder, traps, she'd learn later, steel leg traps that clanked faintly against each other with each step. And he walked with the unhurried pace of a man who'd decided where he was going a long time ago and saw no reason to rush now. He stopped when he saw her. She met his eyes because she'd learned the hard way that looking away first gave something away that she couldn't afford to give. He looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't shift. He wasn't startled by her, or if he was, it didn't show. He took in her coat, her posture, her face, in the way a person takes inventory of something that might require action. "You got somewhere to go?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, pitched to carry through wind without shouting. "I'm fine," she said. Her jaw was starting to seize, and the words came out slightly wrong, slightly too careful, the way words do when your body is trying to conserve heat. He looked at her for another moment. Then his gaze moved to her hands, which she'd tucked under her arms, and then to her feet. "Those aren't winter boots," he said. "I said I'm fine." "Yeah," he said. He didn't say it like he agreed. He said it the way people say yeah when they mean no, but don't want to argue about it yet. He shifted the traps on his shoulder and looked at the storm coming down the street toward them both, and then he looked back at her. "I've got a cabin," he said. "1.5 miles up the north track. I was heading there now." He paused. "I'm making supper when I get there." She stared at him. "That's it?" she said. "That's what I've got," he said. "Come or don't. I'm not going to stand here explaining it while the temperature drops." She studied him the way she'd learned to study men, looking for the thing behind the thing, the motive beneath the offer, the shape of what it was going to cost her. He was watching her do it, and he didn't seem offended by it or impatient with it. He just waited. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said. "Name's Garrick Thorne. I trapped the North Range." "Maeve Holloway. All right." He nodded once, as if this settled something. "You coming?" The wind hit them both at the same moment, a gust that came around the corner of the livery with genuine violence, and she felt her body respond to it before her mind made any decision. A full-body shudder, the deep, involuntary kind, the kind that doesn't care about pride. He turned and started walking. She followed him. The 1.5 miles took the better part of an hour in the storm. The north track was not a road. It was a suggestion, a set of intentions imposed on the mountainside by years of foot traffic and horse traffic and the slow insistence of use, and under 2 inches of snow it was nearly invisible. Garrick walked it the way she imagined he walked everything, steadily, without comment, reading the ground through instinct and repetition. He adjusted their path twice without explanation, and both times she realized afterward that he'd avoided something, a dip that had filled with snow and ice, a spot where the rock beneath was angled wrong. He didn't talk. She was grateful for that because talking required breath she needed for other things, like putting one foot in front of the other, which was harder than it should have been. Her feet were completely numb now, and the numbness had moved up past her ankles. She focused on Garrick's back, the wide, dark shape of him against the white, and used it as the only fixed point in a moving world. At some point she stumbled, not badly. She caught herself on one knee, hand plunging into snow, but he heard it and turned. He looked down at her for a moment, then reached out a hand, not urgently, not with the fuss she'd learned to distrust, just offered it, the same way he'd offered supper. "Take it or don't." She took it. His grip was steady and dry and warm in a way that shocked her. She hadn't realized how cold her own hand was until she felt the contrast, and he pulled her upright without effort and then let go immediately, which she noticed. They kept walking. The cabin appeared out of the storm the way things appear in blizzards, not gradually, but suddenly, the shape of it materializing from the white with a specificity that felt almost startling. It was not a large structure. It was built into the rock face of the mountain on 2 sides. The other 2 walls of thick-hewn logs fitted tight, a low-pitched roof angled to shed snow, a chimney that wasn't yet smoking. There was a covered porch area, barely, just a roof extension over the door, and a woodpile that was substantial enough that Maeve felt a faint loosening somewhere in her chest just looking at it. Garrick moved the bar from the door. There was no lock, just a heavy wooden bar on the outside and the inside both, and pushed it open. He gestured for her to go first. She went inside. The cabin was one room, which told her things. She'd been in enough houses to read them quickly. What a space said about the person who lived in it, what arrangements had been made or assumed, what the layout implied about expectations. One room meant everything was visible. There was a main area with a stone fireplace at one end, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner. Along one wall, shelves of supplies, canned goods, dried food, a row of glass jars with things she couldn't identify in the dark. Along the opposite wall, a sleeping area. A bunk built into the wall itself, with a mattress that looked like it had been stuffed by hand and blankets folded with a precision that seemed out of character for everything else. A second, narrower bunk above it, clearly used for storage. Boxes, extra supplies, folded canvas. She stood in the middle of the room and dripped onto the floor. Garrick set down his traps near the door and moved to the fireplace without looking at her. He worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Paper, kindling, 2 logs from the stack beside the hearth, and the fire caught inside of 3 minutes. He moved to the wood stove next, lit that as well, and only then straightened up and turned around. "Coat," he said. "Excuse me?" "Get it off while it's wet. Hang it on that peg by the door. It'll dry faster than if you wear it through supper." She thought about saying something. She decided not to. She hung the coat. He turned away to the wood stove. The warmth started slowly, the way warmth does in a very cold room. You feel it on your face first, then your hands, and then the problem with warming up too fast started to become apparent because her feet began to ache in a way that was actually good news, but felt like punishment. She sat down on one of the chairs near the fire without being invited to and pulled off her boots. She heard him stop moving. She looked up. He was looking at her feet, at the boots, which were now clearly wrong in every possible way for what she'd been walking through. Thin-soled city boots, the leather warped and dark with wet, the heel on the left one worn through to a metal tack she'd been feeling for 2 days. And her stockings, which she began peeling off with careful hands, revealed feet that were splotched white and red and that she didn't fully trust. Garrick crossed to the shelf, opened a wooden box, came back with a piece of cloth and a tin of something. He crouched down without asking and took her right foot in both hands. She pulled back. He looked up at her. His face was level and direct, and there was nothing in it she could read as threat. "Frostbite," he said. "Not deep yet. But you need circulation back. I'm not going to hurt you." She sat still and let him. He worked with the same efficiency he'd applied to everything else, rubbing the cloth over her feet with firm, careful pressure. Not rough, not gentle exactly, but methodical. The tin was some kind of salve, grease-smelling, and he applied it to the worst spots. He didn't look at her while he did it. He looked at what he was doing. "You'll want to stay close to the fire tonight," he said. "Keep them warm but not hot. Hot hurts, and it doesn't help." "I know," she said. He glanced up briefly. "You been frostbit before?" "No, my father told me." He nodded and went back to what he was doing. He made supper without asking what she wanted or whether she was hungry. He seemed to understand, the way practical men sometimes do, that asking was its own kind of cruelty when the answer was obviously yes, and had been yes for some time. He cooked over the wood stove, salt pork from a crock, dried beans that had been soaking in a pot on the back of the stove since that morning, cornbread baked in a cast-iron pan. It was not complicated food. It was not trying to be. The smell of it filled the cabin and made the cold outside feel very far away. He set a plate in front of her and a cup of coffee and sat across the table and ate his own food in silence. She ate. She ate more than she intended to. She'd meant to be careful, to eat slowly, to show she wasn't desperate. But her body made different decisions, and she finished everything on the plate before she remembered her own plan. When she looked up, he was watching her in a way that wasn't unkind, wasn't pitying, was simply attentive, as if he was noting something. "There's more," he said. "I'm fine." "There's more," he said again, simply. She pushed the plate toward him. He served more from the pot without comment. She ate that too. Afterward, he cleared the table and washed the dishes in a basin with water from a barrel in the corner. She watched him do it. She couldn't remember the last time she'd watched a man clean up after a meal. "How long is the storm?" she asked. He didn't turn around. 3 days? Maybe 4? Depends on the upper country. "I need to find work," she said, "when it breaks." "All right. I can't stay here." He set the last dish on the shelf and turned around. "I didn't ask you to." She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing in his face that demanded anything of her. Not gratitude, not explanation, not anything. It was the kind of face that was simply present, simply there, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't name because she'd learned to read faces for the thing they wanted from her, and she couldn't find it here. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why bring me here? You don't know me." He thought about that for a moment, not like the question was difficult, but like he was deciding whether to answer the actual question or some other version of it. "You were going to die in the street," he said. "I didn't want that." "You don't know me," she said again. "No," he agreed. He went and sat in the other chair by the fire. He picked up something from the shelf beside it, a knife and a piece of wood, and began to work at it, slowly. I don't need to know you to not want that. She thought about that. There's extra blankets in the chest under the storage bunk, he said, without looking up from the wood. Take the main bunk. I've slept in the chair before. I'm not taking your bed. Then sleep in the chair. I don't care either way. He continued carving. The fire crackled. The wind outside the cabin was a low, sustained howl that made the walls seem very solid by contrast. She got the blankets out of the chest. She took them to the chair closest to the fire and settled into it, wrapped in rough wool that smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and she watched the fire for a while. Garrett continued working on his piece of wood. He didn't look at her. He didn't seem to expect anything. The silence wasn't comfortable exactly. She didn't know him, and she didn't trust easily, and the circumstances were as strange as any she'd been in, but it wasn't tense. It was just quiet. The storm hammered at the roof. You trap for a living? She said. She didn't know why she asked it. Mostly, he said. Some hunting, some work for hire in the summers. Long way from town. That's the point, he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the wood. You don't like people much, she said. He considered that. I like people fine when there aren't too many of them. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched since she'd arrived in Coldwater Gulch, since before that, for months, loosened very slightly. Not much. She didn't let it, but a little. I'm not trouble, she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended, less like information and more like a statement she was making to herself as much as to him. I'm not, whatever you're thinking, I'm not running from the law. I haven't stolen anything. I just ended up here. He looked up from the wood. His eyes were dark and level. I didn't think you were trouble, he said. You don't know that. No, he said. But you ate like someone who hadn't eaten in 3 days, and you checked every corner of this room when you walked in, and when I crouched down, you pulled back before you let me near your feet. He paused. That's not the law you're running from. She said nothing. He went back to the wood. You don't have to explain it, he said. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the fire. But she didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the chair with her feet tucked under her and listened to the storm and to the sound of Garrick eventually setting aside his carving and settling into the other chair and going quiet in the way that large men go quiet when they sleep. A specific, deep stillness that she recognized was actual sleep and not performance. She'd learned to tell the difference. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the underside of the log beams, the way they fitted together, the rope and mud chinking between them that sealed out the wind. It was solid work. Someone had built this to last. She thought about Everett Crane, which she tried not to do but sometimes did anyway, especially in the dark when her defenses were lower. She thought about the house on Clearwater Road, which had been a good-looking house from the outside. White paint, a porch, curtains in the windows. And about how houses were like that sometimes. She thought about the morning she'd made her decision, finally, after the incident with the kitchen door. Not because it was the worst thing that had happened, but because it was the moment she understood with cold certainty that things were not going to improve in the direction she'd been hoping. She thought about packing a bag while he was at the bank, taking only what she could carry in one hand, walking out the front door in the middle of a Wednesday morning as if she was going to the market. She thought about his face when he'd come home. Not that she'd seen it. She'd been 3 miles away by then, walking toward the stage road. But she knew what his face looked like when he was angry, and she imagined it, and the imagining was enough to make her pull the blanket tighter. Everett had money. He had influence. He had a way of being charming that made people like him and a way of being certain that made people believe what he said about situations and people and outcomes. She'd run from Clearwater because she'd had to. She'd ended up in Coldwater Gulch because the freight wagon had only gone so far. She looked at Garrick Thorne, asleep in his chair on the other side of the fire, and thought that she had no earthly idea what he was, or what he wanted, or what this was, and that in the morning she would have to figure out something, some plan, some direction. But she was warm. She was warm, and there was food in her stomach, and outside the storm was doing what storms did while inside nothing was happening to her. Nothing bad, nothing expected, nothing that cost her anything. She hadn't been warm without cost in a long time. She slept. The morning came gray and muffled, the light through the cabin's single window, the flat white of a world buried in snow. She woke before Garrick, which surprised her. She'd expected him to be the kind of man who was already up and purposeful while the rest of the world was still horizontal, and she lay still for a moment, remembering where she was and why. He was still in the chair, head back, one hand resting on his knee. He'd kept the fire banked through the night, she realized. It was still going, still warm, which meant he'd woken at some point to tend it. Her feet were stiff, but they were hers again. The pain was back in her heel where the boot had worn through. She considered these things and decided they were fine. She got up carefully and added 2 logs to the fire and stood by it for a minute, looking around the cabin in daylight with the particular clarity of someone trying to understand their situation. The shelves were well stocked, more than she'd expected. Rows of canned goods, jars of dried beans and rice and cornmeal, smoked meat wrapped in cloth. There was a second water barrel she hadn't noticed the night before, full. He'd stocked a winter's worth of supplies for one person, which meant there was room for 2 for a while if it came to that. She found a pot and filled it from the barrel and put it on the stove. She found coffee in a tin and measured it out. She used more than was strictly necessary because she hadn't had good coffee in weeks, and she decided this was a reasonable indulgence. And when it was ready, she sat back in her chair and held the cup in both hands and looked at the fire. Garrick woke up. She heard it in the shift of his breathing, the small movement of the chair. She didn't look at him. After a moment, he said, "You made coffee." "There's more," she said, using his words from the night before. She heard him move, heard the pour of the cup. He settled back into his chair. Neither of them spoke for a while, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't quite. "The storm's still going," she said. "Yes." "Your traps," she said. "You left them by the door." "They can wait." She turned the cup in her hands. Outside, the wind was still a constant, low violence against the walls. "I can cook," she said. "While I'm here, I can earn my keep that way." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to earn anything." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm telling you I will." He looked at her over his coffee cup. There was something in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite approval, a kind of recognition. "All right," he said. She nodded. That was settled then. The second day was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because the novelty, if you could call it that, of surviving wore off. And what was left was the strange reality of being in a very small space with a man she didn't know, doing ordinary things. She cooked breakfast, cornmeal mush with dried fruit stirred in, which was not glamorous but was hot and good, and he ate it without complaint and washed his own dishes after, which she hadn't expected. He spent the morning working on his equipment at the table, mending a section of net, sharpening blades, moving with a quiet absorption that didn't require her participation. She mended a hole in her stocking. She'd found a needle and thread in a small tin on the shelf where it seemed to live permanently, and felt the strange domestic peace of 2 people being quiet in the same room. It was easier because nothing happened. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't small to her. In the afternoon, with the storm still sealing them in, she started asking him things. Not about himself, she wasn't ready for that, and she sensed he wasn't either, but about the practical world she was in. How cold could it get? What did frostbite look like when it was actually dangerous? Could you eat pine bark? Where would a woman find work in the high country if she was willing to work hard and didn't mind rough conditions? He answered each one directly, without condescension, without making her feel stupid for not knowing. He'd been up here a long time, that was clear, and the knowledge he had wasn't book knowledge. It was ground level and specific and useful, the kind that doesn't transfer well but does transfer if you're paying attention. She paid attention. "There's a trading post at Ridger's Fork," he said, 8 miles east. Man named Henner runs it. He trades with the Ute bands in the summer and with the mining camps in winter. His wife died 2 years back, and he's been managing alone since. He paused. "He's not an easy man, but he's fair. You think he'd take on help?" "I think you'd have to ask him. I think he'd be a fool not to." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment. She turned it over. "When the storm breaks. When the storm breaks." On the 3rd day, she found the books. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for something to do with her hands while Garrick worked outside in a brief lull in the storm, checking the roof and clearing snow from the porch. And she'd moved a box on the storage bunk that turned out to be lighter than it looked. When it shifted, She saw what was beneath. Not a single book, but a stack of them, worn and dense, their spines cracked from use. She pulled them out carefully. They were not what she expected. She'd imagined. She wasn't sure what. A Bible, maybe almanacs. Instead, there was a surveying manual, 2 novels she didn't recognize, a book on medicinal plants, a collection of journals that turned out to be someone's actual field notes, and a volume of poetry so worn that the cover had separated from the spine and was held on with a strip of leather. She was sitting on the floor with the poetry book in her lap when Garrick came back inside. He stopped, looked at her, looked at the books. "Sorry," she said, starting to gather them. "You don't need to be sorry," he said. She held up the poetry book. "This is yours?" He pulled off his outer coat and hung it up. "My mother's," he said. He crossed to the fire, held his hands out. "She gave it to me when I left home. I don't read it much, but I can't leave it behind." She looked down at the book. The pages were thin and slightly wavy at the edges, the kind that came from being read near a window in humid weather. "Do you read the others?" "The survey manual, yes. The plant book." He sat down. "The novels when the winter is long." "How long are your winters?" "Long enough." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a full smile, but it was adjacent to one. She opened the plant book carefully. "Can I?" "Go ahead." She read by the fire for the rest of the afternoon, and he went back to his equipment, and the storm continued outside, and it was not a comfortable situation, and it was not a terrible one. And Maeve Holloway sat on the floor of a mountain trapper's cabin with a borrowed book and thought that strange was not the same thing as bad, and that she'd been confused about that for a long time. The 4th night, she had a nightmare. Not unusual. She had them sometimes. Not as often as she used to, not since she'd left Clearwater, but sometimes. This one was the kitchen door, which in the dream opened and kept opening, the way doors don't in real life, the way they do when the logic of sleep takes over from the logic of physics. And on the other side of it was Everett's face, and his voice saying her name the way he said it when he was certain he'd found her. She woke up already sitting up, already breathing hard, and she was in the chair by the fire, and the cabin was dark except for the coals, and there was absolutely nothing wrong. She sat still and breathed. Across the room, she heard Garrick shift in his bunk. He'd given her the chair again, having refused all offers to switch, with a stubbornness that matched her own exactly, and then his voice, low and without alarm. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Silence. "Bad dream," she said, because he hadn't asked and it felt important to say. "All right," he said. The coals glowed. The wind had dropped a little. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. "You can put another log on if you want," he said. "I don't mind." She got up and put a log on and watched the fire catch it, and the light grew, and she sat back down. "Garrick," she said. "Yes." "Nothing." She shook her head. "Never mind." He was quiet. Then, "You don't have to have a reason to use a person's name." She didn't say anything to that, but something in her chest did something she didn't have a word for. She watched the fire until it was high and orange and certain, and then she slept again, and this time there were no dreams. So, the storm broke on the 5th day. Not dramatically. It didn't end the way it had arrived, all at once, with violence, but rather softened over the course of a morning, the wind dropping by degrees, the snow thinning from a howl to a mutter to a whisper, and then by midday the sky had gone from white to pale gray to a fragile blue that looked almost uncertain of itself, like it was trying something new. Garrick opened the door and they both stood in the doorway looking at it. The world was entirely white. The trees at the tree line were buried to their lower branches. The path down to the north track was invisible under what looked like 4 feet of new snow. The air was still and cold and so clear that she could see, far in the distance, the dark line of the valley floor, and beyond it, the suggestion of the lower country. "The track won't be passable for a day or 2, he said. "Maybe 3. "Okay," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to—" She stopped. Started again. "I just know. It's fine." He nodded once and went to get the shovel to start clearing the porch. She went to start breakfast. The mountain was quiet in the way that only mountains are quiet after a storm, a profound, absolute stillness that felt less like the absence of sound and more like its own kind of sound, some frequency below what the ears could manage. She stood at the window for a moment before she started cooking and looked at it, all of it, the white and the blue and the impossible distance. She was still alive. She didn't say that out loud. She barely let herself think it in any direct way. But it was there, underneath everything, the plain fact of it. She had been moments from dying in the mud of a street in a town that didn't know her name, and she was still here, looking at a mountain in winter, and her feet were sore but they were hers, and she'd had food and warmth and something she hadn't been able to name yet, but thought might be the very first edge of feeling safe. She'd figure out the rest. She always did. But she let herself stand there for a moment, just that one moment, and look at the quiet white world outside. Then she turned back to the stove and started making breakfast, and the morning smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and outside Garrick Thorne scraped the porch clear with the steady rhythm of a man who'd been doing it alone for years and didn't yet know that was going to change. The track opened on the second day after the storm broke, or at least opened enough for a man who knew it well to get through. Garrick spent the morning packing a small sledge with furs he'd been preparing since October, marten, beaver, 2 fox pelts that he'd stretched and dried on frames by the back wall, and Maeve watched him work without asking questions she already knew the answers to. He was going down to Coldwater Gulch to trade. She knew it without being told because she'd been paying attention for 5 days, and she understood by now that the man did not move without reason. Everything he did had a purpose, not in the rigid way of someone who needed to control things, but in the natural economy of a person who'd lived alone long enough that waste of time, of material, of words, had stopped making sense to him. "I'll be back before dark," he said, not looking up from the buckle he was working on the sledge harness. "If I'm not, it means I stopped at Henner's on the way back. Don't worry about it." "I wasn't going to worry about it," she said. He looked at her then, briefly, and she thought she saw the edge of that almost smile again. "There's salt pork in the crock, and enough wood on the porch for a week. You won't run out of anything." "I know how to be alone in a house," she said. "I know you do." He straightened and picked up the sledge rope. "I'll ask around about work while I'm in town. Discreetly." She hadn't asked him to do that. She looked at him. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said, using her own phrasing back at her. And this time there was no hiding the slight curve at the corner of his mouth. He turned and started down the track without another word, pulling the sledge behind him, and she stood on the porch in the cold morning air and watched him go until the trees took him. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went inside and looked at the cabin with the particular eyes of a person left in charge of something they didn't ask for and didn't quite know what to do with. She cleaned it. Not because it was dirty. Garrick kept the place with a practical tidiness that suggested no one had taught him to do it. He'd just decided that disorder cost something he wasn't willing to pay. But because she needed to do something with her hands, and because there were corners that hadn't been reached in a while, surfaces that needed attention, small tasks that revealed the cabin's actual structure beneath the surface of day-to-day use. She swept and wiped down the shelf fronts and reorganized the supply jars so she could read their labels without tilting her head, and then she stopped herself and looked at what she'd done and considered whether she'd overstepped. The jars were easier to read now. She decided that was neutral. She made herself useful in other ways after that. She brought in more wood from the porch stack and restacked it nearer the stove for easy access. She checked the water barrel and found it low enough to matter and spent 2 trips packing snow in buckets and melting it, which was slow but satisfying in the mechanical way that physical tasks are satisfying when your mind is doing something difficult in the background. Her mind was doing several difficult things simultaneously. She was thinking about Everett. Not the nightmare version, not his face in the open door, but the practical version, the real one. The one who had money and influence and would, she was nearly certain, be looking for her. Not because he missed her, because she'd left without permission, and Everett Crane did not tolerate that specific form of disrespect from anyone, let alone a woman he'd considered his property. She'd been careful about the route she'd taken. She'd been careful about names. She'd given a false name at the hotel in Reader's Crossing, and she'd paid in cash the 4 times she'd needed to, and she hadn't written to anyone because there was no one she trusted enough to write to. She thought she'd been careful enough. She also knew that careful enough and safe weren't the same thing, and that the geography between here and Clearwater, however many miles it was, and she'd stopped counting somewhere around 300, was only one kind of distance. She thought about Coldwater Gulch and its locked doors, and decided she didn't want to go back there if she could avoid it. She thought about Henner's trading post at Ridger's Fork, 8 miles east. She thought about what Garrick had said. Fair, but not easy. She thought that those were terms she could work with. Easy had stopped being what she was looking for some time ago. She was on her second cup of coffee reading the plant book again. There was a section on fever treatments that she kept returning to, not for any specific reason, but because it was the kind of knowledge that felt like it mattered. When she heard footsteps on the porch, she was on her feet before the door opened. It was Garrick. He came through the door with snow on his shoulders and a paper-wrapped package under one arm and a look on his face that was carefully neutral in the specific way faces go, carefully neutral when they've got something to say and haven't decided how. "You're back early," she said. "Roads were clear enough. Henner's was on the way back, so I stopped." He set the package on the table and shrugged out of his coat. "He's interested." She looked at the package, then at him. "In hiring me?" "I told him I knew a woman looking for work. Capable, good with a kitchen, willing to work hard. Didn't say anything else." He sat down and pulled off his boot to check something on his heel, a spot that had been giving him trouble since the storm, she'd noticed. He said, "Come up when the track allows, and he'd talk to you." "That's not the same as yes." "No," he agreed. "But it's not no." She looked at the package. "What's that?" "Boots," he said, not looking up. "From the general store. Henner's wife left some things when she passed. Women's things, clothing, boots. Henner's been trying to sell them off. I traded him for these." He paused. "They might not fit right, but they're better than what you had." She stared at him. "Don't make it into something," he said. "I wasn't—" "You were about to." He looked up then. His eyes were direct and a little exasperated in a way that was almost warm. "I traded furs for them. They're practical. Your feet are still recovering, and you can't walk to Ridger's Fork in those—" He gestured toward her city boots sitting by the door, still warped and sad. "That's the whole of it." She unwrapped the package. The boots were brown leather, heavier than what she was used to, lace up to mid-calf with a solid heel and lug soles. They were women's boots, but the kind made for actual weather, not for looking well-dressed in it. She turned them over in her hands. "Try them," he said. She pulled one on. It was slightly wide in the toe and slightly high in the ankle, and about as perfect as a second-hand boot from a dead woman was going to get. She pulled on the second one, laced both up, stood up and walked 3 steps and back. "Well," he said. "They're good," she said. She sat back down and looked at them on her feet, and then looked at the fire. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, without the performance of gratitude that she'd learned people sometimes expected. The excessive kind that was really about making the giver feel good, rather than acknowledging the thing itself. Thank you was what she meant, and it was what she said. He nodded once, like that was settled, and went back to his heel. She went back to the plant book, but she wasn't really reading. She was thinking that nobody had done something practical for her without wanting something back in a very long time, and that she didn't quite know what to do with that, and that she was going to have to figure it out because she had a feeling it mattered. The days after the storm had a different quality than the days inside it. During the blizzard, there had been a kind of enforced simplicity to things. The storm was the problem. Surviving it was the solution. Everything else was secondary. Now the world had reopened, and with it came the return of complexity. She was still in Garrick Thorne's cabin, sleeping in his chair, eating his food, and the arrangement had a provisional quality that she was acutely aware of even if he didn't seem to be. She brought it up on the 3rd morning after the storm. "I should figure out a timeline," she said over breakfast. He looked up from his plate. "For Henner's," she said. "And for here. How long I'm here." He considered this. "Track's passable now," he said. "We could go to Ridger's Fork in a day if you wanted. Is that what you think I should do?" "I think it's your decision." She stirred her coffee. "You're not going to tell me to stay or go?" "No." "Why not?" He set down his fork and looked at her with the direct patience that she'd started to recognize as his baseline mode of engagement. "Because you're not a problem I'm trying to solve," he said. "You can stay here through the winter if you need to, and there's room enough and supplies enough. You can go to Henner's and work and not come back. You can do something else entirely. It's not my business." "You brought me here," she said. "Yes." "That makes it a little bit your business." He picked his fork back up. "Then here's what I think," he said, without looking at her. I think Henner will hire you because he needs the help and you're capable. I think working there through the winter is probably a reasonable plan. I think what comes after that is a different question, and you don't need to answer it now." He paused. "That's all I've got." She looked at him for a moment. "You're a strange man," she said. "Probably," he said, and ate his eggs. They went to Henner's 2 days later. The Ridger's Fork track was narrower than the North track and ran along the eastern face of the mountain, which meant it got sun in the afternoon and the snow had compacted rather than deepened. Garrick took a horse, a gray mare named something he'd never told Maeve and which she'd started thinking of privately as Gray, and she walked beside it because she preferred walking to riding when the terrain was uncertain, and he didn't question this preference, simply adjusted his pace to hers. The 8 miles took most of the morning. The conversation was intermittent. He pointed out things on the way, practical things. A spring that stayed unfrozen through the coldest months, a specific rock formation that marked the halfway point, a stand of pine that had been taken by beetles 2 summers back and would be deadfall by spring and was therefore good to know about. She filed it all away. She didn't know why she was filing it. She just knew that information about the mountain felt important to have. Henner's trading post was not pretty. It was larger than Garrick's cabin, 2 rooms that she could see, with a covered porch stacked with goods and a separate storage building out back. And it had the cluttered, overloaded look of a place that had been accumulating function at the expense of form for 20 years. Signs of a woman's hand were still visible if you looked. A window box that had held flowers once, now empty. A specific way the curtains were hung that spoke of someone who'd cared about it. But those things were old touches, and everything more recent had the blunt practicality of a man managing alone. Henner himself was a short, square-built man of about 60, with a gray beard cut close and eyes that were sharp and a little suspicious in the way of someone who'd been fooled before and disliked the memory. He looked Maeve over with the frank assessment of a man who had no time for social pretense. "You cook?" he said. "Not hello, not nice to meet you." "Yes," she said. "Clean?" "Yes." "I've got inventory that needs organizing and a root cellar that needs checking twice a week. Animals need water morning and night. That's in addition to the house." He looked at Garrick briefly, then back at her. "I can pay $4 a month and board." It was less than she'd hoped and more than she'd feared. "5, she said. He looked at her. "I'm not negotiating for fun," she said. "4's not enough, and you know it. 5 and board, and I'll stay through spring." He looked at Garrick again. Garrick had turned to look at something in the middle distance with elaborate disinterest. "4.50, Henner said. "5, she said. A pause. "Fine," he said. Garrick turned back around. His face was neutral. His eyes weren't quite. She moved in that afternoon into a small room off the back of the main building that had a real bed. Narrow, iron-framed, with a mattress that was less than ideal but was still a mattress, and a window that looked east toward the ridge. She put her few things down on the shelf and stood in the room for a moment. It was hers. For now. That was enough. The first week at Henner's was work, straight through, the kind that exhausted her enough to sleep without dreaming. Henner had not been exaggerating about the inventory. The storage room was in a state that suggested he'd been putting off dealing with it since his wife died. Boxes half unpacked, goods stacked without logic, things that should have been rotated out 2 seasons ago still sitting on top. She spent 3 full days in there, cold enough that she had to keep stopping to warm her hands at the small stove in the main room, systematically dismantling the disorder and rebuilding it into something that made sense. Henner watched this from the doorway on the second day. He said nothing. On the third day, he appeared with a cup of coffee, set it on the nearest surface, and left again without comment. She understood this as approval. She understood Henner's, not in the sense of liking him. He was prickly and impatient and had a habit of starting conversations in the middle as if you'd already been listening for a while, but in the sense of reading him accurately, which was the part that mattered. He was a man who worked and expected others to work, and had no interest in performing warmth he didn't feel. Under that, he was fair. He did what he said he'd do. He paid what he'd promised on the day he said he'd pay it. He didn't make her feel afraid. After Clearwater, fair felt like more than it should have. She was aware of this. She tried not to let it make her grateful for things that were simply baseline decent. Garrick came by on the 8th day. She was in the root cellar when she heard the horse. The sound was distinct. the mayor's particular way of moving, and she came up the cellar steps and found him in the yard. He'd brought supplies he'd said he was going to trade for in Coldwater Gulch, some additional rope, a tin of nails that Henner had asked for, and without explanation, a small cloth bag that he handed to her directly. She opened it. Dried apples. She looked at him. They had them at the general store, he said. Figured you hadn't had anything sweet in a while. She closed the bag. Thank you. They were cheap, he said, which wasn't the point but seemed to need saying. I know, she said. Thank you anyway. He stayed for an hour. She made coffee. Henner was out doing something with a horse that was having trouble with a hoof, and they sat in the main room of the trading post and drank it. And she told him about the inventory project, and he listened with the specific attention he brought to practical information, asking one or two questions about the shelving arrangement that were actually useful. She found herself talking more than she'd intended, not about anything sensitive, just talking. About the root cellar, about Henner's organizational system, about the way the eastern window let in morning light that made the room feel bigger than it was. At some point she realized he was looking at her differently than he had in the cabin. Not in a way she couldn't handle, in a way she wasn't sure she'd been looked at before. Like she was interesting, specifically, like the things she was saying were worth attending to, not because he was being polite, but because he actually wanted to hear them. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at her coffee cup. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm talking too much. You're not, he said. She glanced at him. He met her eyes and then looked away first, which wasn't something she'd seen him do before. She picked up the thread of what she'd been saying about the root cellar and kept going, and he kept listening, and neither of them addressed what had just happened in the room, which was almost certainly the right call. He left in the early afternoon to make it back before dark. She stood on Henner's porch and watched the horse carry him back up the track, and then she went inside and finished the root cellar inventory, and she ate 3 of the dried apples that evening, and they were good. Not remarkable, just dried apples, slightly tough, sweet in the specific concentrated way of dried fruit, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months that she almost didn't recognize, something that was almost contentment. She didn't trust it. She'd learned the hard way that good things arriving unexpectedly came with a cost that wasn't visible yet, that the bill would show up later in some form you hadn't planned for. She'd thought Clearwater Road was a good thing once. She'd been wrong in a way that had cost her 3 years and more than she'd named even to herself. But she ate the dried apples. She let herself have that much. On the 12th day, a man came through the trading post from the lower valley. He was a miner, or had been. She could read that in the particular way his hands were broken and his back went, and he was heading further up the range to work a claim he had with a partner near the Caldwell Ridge. He bought supplies and talked too much in the way of men who've been alone for a while, and Maeve managed the transaction and kept her face pleasant and her answers short. He mentioned near the end that there'd been a man in the lower valley last week asking about a woman traveling alone. Well-dressed man. Expensive horse. Offering money for information. He said it the way people say things they think are interesting, without understanding why the person they're talking to has gone very still. What did he look like? She said. She kept her voice even. He described a man with light hair and a good coat, and the particular kind of confidence that comes with money and certainty. He described the horse in more detail than the man, a bay, well-fed, good tack. She said, and finished the transaction and said goodbye, and went into the back room and stood with her back against the wall for 3 minutes, not moving, just breathing and thinking. Everett was in the lower valley. Not here, not yet, but in the territory. He'd made it this far, which meant either she hadn't been as careful as she thought, or he had more reach than she'd estimated. Possibly both. She thought about this with the cold arithmetic she'd developed for exactly this kind of information. He didn't know where she was. If he did, he'd be here, not asking questions in the valley. He was looking, not arriving. That was different. That meant she had time, and time was the one resource she'd learned to spend carefully. She could run. She'd done it before and knew the mechanics of it. She could be packed and down the track before dark. She looked at the back room, the narrow bed, the east window, the shelf with her 3 possessions on it, and then she thought about Garrick's face when she'd told him about the inventory, the way he'd asked the question about the shelving arrangement, the dried apples. She thought about being 31 years old and running for the rest of her life. She stood up from the wall and went back out into the main room and finished the afternoon's work. And when Henner came in for supper, she had it on the table, and she sat across from him and ate her own food, and she did not say anything about the man in the valley. She wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. But she thought about it all night, lying in the narrow bed with the east window dark and the cold settling around the building, working through it the way she worked through anything that needed solving, methodically, without panic, looking for the shape of it, the place where the problem had an edge she could push on. She was still alive. She'd made it this far. And somewhere up the north track, a mile and a half into the mountain, a trapper's cabin was sitting with its fire banked and its woodpile full, and she thought about that with a feeling she didn't examine too directly. She'd figure it out. She always did. She just needed to figure it out before Everett Crane figured out where she was. She didn't tell Garrick about the man in the valley. She almost did. Twice. The first time was when he came by 4 days after the miner's visit, bringing a coil of rope Henner had ordered and staying long enough for coffee. And she sat across from him at Henner's rough table and watched him wrap both hands around his cup and thought about how to say it. The words were right there. A man came through. He matched Everett's description. He's asking about me in the lower valley. Plain and simple. She could have said it in under 20 seconds. She didn't. The second time was the following week, when he came to help Henner shore up a section of the storage building's roof that had taken damage from the snow weight. She worked alongside them, handing up boards, holding things in place when 4 hands weren't enough. And at one point, Garrick looked down at her from the roof with snow in his beard and sawdust on his coat and said, "You're quiet today." And she thought, "Now, say it now." "I'm always quiet," she said instead. He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary, then went back to the board he was nailing. She told herself it was because she didn't want to involve him. That was true, as far as it went. But the fuller truth, the one she worked on at night in the narrow bed when the east window was black and the cold pressed in from all sides, was that she didn't want him to look at her differently. The specific way he looked at her now, like she was capable, like she was a person who handled things, was something she hadn't had in a long time, and she was afraid that if she told him about Everett, she'd see something else come into his face. Pity, maybe. Or worse, that careful neutrality people use when they're recalculating what you're worth to them based on new information. So she said nothing, and she watched the track from Henner's porch every morning and evening, and she started sleeping with her boots on the floor beside the bed instead of under the shelf where she'd been keeping them, just in case. What happened instead of Everett arriving was something she hadn't planned for at all. She got sick. It came on a Tuesday, which she knew because Henner did his accounts on Mondays, and the ledger was still open on the table. She'd felt wrong when she woke up, a heaviness behind her eyes and a rawness in her throat that she'd tried to dismiss as dry winter air, and by mid-morning the heaviness had become a full weight pressing down on her skull, and the rawness had become a scrape every time she swallowed. She worked through it. She'd worked through worse. By afternoon, she was working more slowly than she should have been, and Henner, who was not a perceptive man about most human things but had a practical attentiveness to the functioning of anyone he depended on, looked at her once and said, "You're sick." "I'm fine." "You're gray," he said. "That's not fine. Go sit down." "I've got the evening animals to do." "I'll do the animals. Go sit." She sat. She sat down in the chair nearest the stove and meant to just rest for a few minutes. And when she opened her eyes again, the stove fire had burned down significantly, and the light had changed, and Henner was at the table eating supper and looking at her with the expression he wore when he was dealing with a situation he hadn't budgeted for. "How long was I asleep?" she said. 2 hours, he said. She tried to stand up, and the room tilted. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Henner was not equipped for illness in the way that most frontier men weren't. Practically useful in a physical emergency, but deeply uncomfortable with anything that required a more sustained, less mechanical form of care. He brought her broth from the pot on the stove and watched her drink it with the expression of a man doing his best at something he hadn't trained for. He put an extra blanket over her. He took her temperature in the backcountry way, the back of his hand to her forehead, and he held it there for a moment and then removed it and said nothing, which told her it was higher than he wanted to say. She spent the night in the chair because walking to the back room felt like more than she could manage. By morning, her temperature had climbed. She knew because she was shivering despite the fire being well stoked, the deep bone shiver that meant fever rather than cold. And her throat was bad enough that swallowing the broth Henner brought was an exercise in determination rather than comfort. She heard him leave in the morning. She heard the horse, She thought dimly that he had supplies to pick up or a trade to make, and she held herself in the chair and focused on staying upright, which was harder than it should have been. She didn't know how much time had passed when the door opened again. She'd been half asleep, the feverish kind where you're not quite unconscious, but you're not really present either, where sounds come from farther away than they should, and she came back to herself slowly when the cold air moved through the room. It was Garrick. He came through the door the same way he always did, without rushing, without drama. But he crossed the room faster than usual, and he crouched down in front of her chair and looked at her face with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not alarm exactly, but close. "Henner came for me," he said. She wanted to say something dismissive. "I'm fine, it's just a cold, you didn't need to come," but the words required more effort than she had, and what came out instead was just his name. "Garrick, I know," he said. He put his hand to her forehead the same way Henner had, but he kept it there longer and his jaw tightened slightly. "How long?" "Yesterday morning," she said, "or the morning before. I'm not—" She stopped because her head felt like it was full of wet wool and the sentence had gotten away from her. He stood up. She heard him moving, the water barrel, the stove, things being organized in the quick, efficient way he had when he'd decided on a course of action. She kept her eyes closed because opening them made the room swim. He came back with something warm and pressed the cup into her hands. Not coffee, something else, something that smelled medicinal and faintly bitter. "Drink it." "What is it?" "Yarrow and willow bark," he said. "Drink it slow." She drank it. It was unpleasant in the way of things that work. He held the cup steady for her when her hand shook, not making a comment about the shaking, just holding it. "Where's Henner?" she said. "Trade to make in Coldwater. He'll be back tonight." Garrick pulled the other chair close and sat in it, not touching her, just close, present in the cabin air the way the fire was present. "You've been out here 6 weeks," he said. "About that. You were already run down when you arrived in the gulch. I should have—" He stopped. "You should have what?" A pause. "I don't know," he said. "Something." He didn't look comfortable with the admission, but he didn't try to take it back. She looked at him. His face in the firelight was familiar to her in a way that had happened without her noticing. The lines of it, the set of his mouth, the specific quality of attention he brought to everything he looked at. She'd learned his face over weeks of small interactions, and now she knew it the way you know a road you've walked many times, its shape automatic. "It's not your fault," she said. "I know that," he said, which sounded less like agreement and more like something he was deciding to believe. She let her eyes close again. The yarrow and willow bark were doing something. She could feel the slight loosening of the fever's grip, the incremental drop of temperature that good medicine produces in the first hour, and the warmth of the fire was different with someone else in the room, less alone. She slept. She woke up in the afternoon to find him at the table with a knife and a piece of wood, the same habit she'd watched him have in the cabin during the storm, and the fire well maintained and another cup of the bitter medicine on the crate beside her chair. She drank it without being told. It was slightly more bearable the second time, which was either because she was getting used to it or because she was sicker than before and less capable of tasting things accurately. She decided it was the first option. "Tell me something," she said. Her voice was rough. He looked up. "Tell you what?" "Anything, talk." She moved under the blanket, trying to find a more comfortable position. "I'm tired of the inside of my head." He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most requests. Then, "There's a canyon 15 miles north of here. I found it 6 years ago following a marten line that went farther than I expected." He went back to the wood. "It runs east to west along the spine of the ridge, maybe half a mile deep. There's a stream at the bottom that stays open all winter, thermals or something underground, I don't know. And there are cave drawings on the east wall, old ones, animals mostly, and some shapes I can't read. You've been back?" "Every summer. I've never told anyone about it." He glanced up. "Not for any particular reason. Just didn't come up." She thought about that. A canyon with old drawings that he'd been visiting alone for 6 years without telling anyone. She thought about what that said about him. Not sad exactly, more like a man who'd gotten used to the idea that experience was his own, that there was no one to share things with, and so you stopped thinking in terms of sharing. "Are they beautiful?" she said. "The drawings." He thought about it. Yes, he said. I think they are. He said it simply, without self-consciousness. She looked at the fire. I'd like to see them sometime, she said, and then was immediately unsure whether she should have said that, whether it was too much of an assumption, too much of a claim on his particular private thing. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, he said, "Summer," and went back to the wood, and she couldn't tell whether it was a promise or just a word. The fever broke and came back. That was the problem. The first day, the yarrow and willow bark, the fire, the sleep, she thought she was improving. She felt better by evening in the specific deceptive way of fevers that settle for a few hours before reasserting. Garrick seemed to understand this because when Henner returned that night and said, "She looks better," Garrick said, "Not yet," in a quiet, flat way that made Henner look at him and then at her and then stop arguing. The second night was bad. She didn't remember all of it. She remembered shaking despite the blankets, a shaking that she couldn't stop. And she remembered voices, Garrick's and Henner's, low and quick in a way they hadn't spoken before. And she remembered cold water on her face and neck, the cloth wrung and applied and wrung again. And at some point she said something she didn't know she was going to say. She said Everett's name. She knew she'd said it because she heard herself saying it. "It's not Everett. Stop. That's not." And then she came up from whatever half level she'd been at, and she was on her back on the narrow bed in the back room with a blanket on her, and Garrick was sitting on the crate beside the bed with the damp cloth, and his face was very still. He looked at her when her eyes opened. He didn't say anything. "How did I get in here?" she said. "Henner and I moved you. The chair wasn't good enough." She looked at the ceiling. The planks were rough and close, and in the lamplight they were amber-colored. "What did I say?" she asked. A pause. "A name," he said. She didn't say anything. "You don't have to," he started. "Everett Crane," she said. Her voice came out steady enough. She'd decided to say it the way you decide to pull a splinter. The deliberation is worse than the act. "He's the man I left. She stopped, organized. "We were engaged to be married. I left before the wedding." Garrick waited. "He's not a man who accepts that," she said. "He has money. He has influence. He's been looking for me." She looked at the ceiling planks. "A miner came through the trading post about 2 weeks ago. He said there was a man in the lower valley matching Everett's description, asking about a woman traveling alone." The room was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "I didn't want—" She stopped again. "I didn't want you to look at me like I was someone else's problem. I'm not. I'm my own problem." She turned her head and looked at him directly. "He hurt me, not once, repeatedly and deliberately. And I left. And I will handle it." He met her eyes. His face hadn't changed. It wasn't pity. It wasn't recalculation. It was something harder and more focused. "I know you'll handle it," he said. "I'm not questioning that. You're angry I didn't tell you. He exhaled. Put the cloth down. "I'm not angry. I'm concerned. There's a difference." He looked at the cloth in his hands. "If I'd known, I'd have been more careful about who came up the track, about who Henner traded with, about—" He stopped himself. "That's not blame. That's just what's true." She looked at him. The lamp was throwing uneven light, and she was still sick, and her throat still ached, and she felt suddenly the full weight of having carried this alone for weeks when she hadn't needed to. "He hasn't found me," she said. "No. He doesn't know I'm here." "Not yet," Garrick said. It was honest rather than reassuring, which was what she needed. If he's in the lower valley, he's probably working his way through the mining camps. He'll talk to teamsters, freight drivers, anyone who moves between settlements. It'll take time. He paused. "But time's not infinite." "I know. So we figure it out." She looked at him. "We," she said. He looked back at her, steady. "You got a problem with that?" She wanted to. She'd built her competence on not needing the word we, on being the person who solved her own things, who didn't add her weight to someone else's load. But she was lying in a sickbed with a fever that had been climbing for 2 days, and the man sitting beside it had been here since morning without being asked, and the word we came from him in the same natural way that the boots and the dried apples had come, without drama, without cost attached. "No," she said. "I don't have a problem with it." He nodded once. "Then rest," he said. "We'll deal with Everett Crane when you're not sick." She closed her eyes. The lamp made the inside of her eyelids orange. She heard him pick up the cloth again, and she felt the cool of it at her hairline, and she didn't flinch and didn't say anything, and after a while she slept. The third day was the worst, which meant, as Garrick had told her once in the plant book conversation about fever patterns, that the turn was coming. Her temperature climbed through the morning to a point where she wasn't fully conscious of what was happening around her, where the room seemed to have a quality to it that she understood was not the room's actual quality. She heard voices. She heard at some point Garrick speaking in a low, hard voice to someone she couldn't see. Henner, she thought, from the rhythm of it, and something about the sharpness in his voice cut through the fog of the fever. She'd heard him speak in many registers by now, and she'd never heard that one. It wasn't raised, it was lower than usual, more compressed, the vocal equivalent of weight. She tried to surface and managed about halfway. "Not getting better fast enough," she heard him say. Henner's voice, lower. "She's tough. She'll come through. That's not a plan." A pause. "The bark isn't enough. I need..." Something she lost. Then, "I have to go back to the cabin. 2 hours." "You'd leave her?" "For 2 hours," Garrick said. "Watch the fever. If it goes higher, more cold cloths on the wrists and neck. Don't let her get too warm even if she asks for it." Then quiet and the sound of the door. He was back in less than 2 hours. She could tell time passing in the way you do when you're sick. Not accurately, but by the quality of light and the frequency of her own breathing and the degree to which the room had shifted. When she heard the horse and then his step on the porch, she was marginally more present than she'd been. He had things from the cabin. She gathered this slowly, a tin she didn't recognize, some dried something that he was adding to water on the stove, a cloth-wrapped package he set on the shelf without explanation. He moved fast and efficiently and without the suppressed tension of a man who was afraid things wouldn't work. He moved like a man who'd decided on an outcome. The new thing he made her drink was worse than the yarrow and willow bark, considerably worse. "What is that?" she said. "Elderberry and echinacea," he said, "and something else." "Drink it." "It tastes like..." "I know," he said. "Drink it anyway." She drank it, every bit of it, holding his gaze across the cup because she wasn't going to flinch from medicine in front of a man who'd ridden to his cabin and back in a mountain winter specifically to get it. That night the fever broke, not dramatically. She woke at some point in the deep middle of the night, the particular darkness that falls between 2 and 4 in the morning when the world seems to be operating without witnesses, and she was wet through with sweat and the burning behind her eyes was gone, not slowly fading, gone. She lay still for a moment and took account of herself, surprised enough by the absence of pain that she wasn't sure whether to trust it. She turned her head. Garrick was in the chair he'd pulled beside the bed, and he was asleep. Not performing sleep, actually asleep. His chin had dropped slightly, his hands were loose on his knees. He'd been awake most of the previous 2 days, she understood that now, in the clear-headed way of someone emerging from fever. He'd sat beside her through the worst of it, and he was asleep now because he'd finally believed she was past it. She looked at him for a while in the dark. The lamp was turned down low, and the light was barely enough to see by, but enough. He'd come back for her. He'd gone to his cabin in a mountain winter to get what she needed, and he'd come back and sat beside her sickbed for 2 days with a consistency that she had no frame for. She kept reaching for the explanation that made sense, obligation, practicality, some accounting she wasn't aware of, and kept coming up empty. There wasn't an angle to it she could find. There was just a man asleep in a chair who'd decided she was worth the trouble without making her pay for the decision. She turned back to the ceiling. She was going to have to do something about Everett. She was going to have to make a plan that was more than wait and see and keep your boots near the bed. She thought about this with the peculiar clarity that comes after a fever, the brain stripped of its usual clutter, the thinking sharp and simple. She was in the mountains. Everett was in the valley. The mountain was not inherently her enemy. The mountain had in fact been unexpectedly hospitable, and she was not alone. She'd have to get used to that, the we of it, the weight of having someone else's capability available to her, the strangeness of not having to shoulder everything from one side. She'd been alone for so long, not just since Clearwater, but before, in a different way, that she wasn't sure she remembered how to distribute weight. She'd have to learn. She thought she probably could. She fell asleep looking at the ceiling planks, and this time there were no voices in the dark, no door that kept opening, no name said by someone she feared. Just sleep, deep and still and entirely her own. When she woke again, the lamp was out and the gray light of early morning was coming through the east window, and the chair beside the bed was empty, and she could smell coffee from the main room. And she understood from the particular quality of the silence on the other side of the door that there was someone in it who was trying to be quiet. She sat up slowly. The room stayed still. Her throat was sore and her body felt like it had been pulled apart and put back together by someone who'd done a reasonable but not perfect job of it. But the fever was gone and she was herself again, fully herself, which felt like a thing worth noting. She put her feet on the floor. She put on her boots, Garrick's trade, the dead woman's boots that fit almost right, and she stood up and she walked to the door and opened it. Garrick was at the stove. He turned when he heard the door, and for a moment he just looked at her, taking account of her the same way she'd taken account of herself in the middle of the night, that quick, honest inventory. Whatever he saw satisfied him. Something in his face loosened slightly. "Coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. She sat down at the table. He poured 2 cups and sat across from her, and they drank in the morning quiet, and outside the east window the sky was doing something with light that was almost beautiful, the kind of thing you only see in winter at altitude, a clarity that hurts slightly, that's too sharp for comfort but too honest to look away from. "I need to talk to you about Everett," she said. "I know," he said. "Not today," she said. "Tomorrow. When I'm—" She gestured vaguely at herself. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The stove was doing its work, and the room was warm, and neither of them said anything more, and that was enough. The tomorrow she'd asked for turned into 3 days, because her body had opinions about the pace of recovery that didn't align with her own, and Garrick enforced them with a patience that was more effective than any argument she could have made against it. He stayed at Henner's. That was the first thing. He didn't announce it or make it into a declaration. He simply didn't leave, the way a rock doesn't leave a riverbed. He took the pallet in the storage room that Henner kept for overnight trade customers, and he paid for his keep by fixing things that had been broken long enough that Henner had stopped seeing them. A hinge on the storage building that had been pulling from the frame, a section of stovepipe that was venting wrong. Henner, who was fundamentally a practical man, accepted this arrangement without comment, because it was useful, and because he'd watched Garrick Thorne sit beside Maeve's sickbed for 2 days, and had revised something in his assessment of the man without naming what. Maeve ate. She slept more than she wanted to. She let herself be managed, which did not come easily, and which she resented in the specific way of someone who knows the resentment is irrational, but feels it anyway. On the second day she got up and tried to help with supper, and Garrick watched her from the doorway with his arms crossed and said nothing for about 4 minutes, which was long enough for her to realize that she was gripping the pot handle harder than the pot required, and that her hands were not entirely steady. She put the pot down and went and sat. "You could have just said something," she said. "You wouldn't have listened," he said, which was true. On the third morning, she felt like herself again, not the fragile post-fever version, but her actual self, the one with edges. She got up before Garrick and made breakfast, and it was done and on the table by the time he appeared in the doorway of the storage room with his hair less organized than usual, and the expression of a man who'd expected to wake up before the person he was watching over. He looked at the table, looked at her. "You're up." "Sit down," she said. "It's getting cold." He sat. They ate. When the plates were clear, she poured more coffee and kept her hands around the cup and said, "Tell me what you know about Everett Crane." He looked at her. "Not what I told you," she said. "What you found out." A pause. He'd known she'd get here. She could see that. He'd been waiting. "When I was in Coldwater Gulch last week, I asked around quietly. The freighter who runs the valley route mentioned a man who'd been asking questions in Reeder's Crossing and 2 camps north of there." He turned his cup on the table. "He's methodical. He's not just riding through and asking. He's staying places long enough to hear things, paying for information. He's got someone with him, a hired man by the description." Maeve's jaw tightened. Of course he did. Everett never did anything alone that could be delegated. He has a name he's using for you, Garrick continued. He's describing you as his wife. Says you're, he stopped. Says what? Says you're not well, Garrick said carefully. That you're confused, that he's trying to bring you home for your own safety. The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind that has weight and temperature. That's what he'd say, she said. Her voice was flat. He's been saying some version of that since before I left. Building the story. Making sure everyone who meets me later already has a reason to not believe what I tell them. She set her cup down. He's been planning this longer than I've been running. Garrick was watching her. He hasn't found you yet. No. But he's got the territory mapped by now, more or less. He knows I came north. He'll work through the mining camps and the trading posts, and eventually, she stopped. Did the arithmetic. How long before he gets to Coldwater Gulch, do you think? If he's working systematically? Garrick thought about it. 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on weather. She nodded slowly. The arithmetic landed where she'd expected it to land. Maeve, he said. She looked up. Tell me what happened, he said. Not the shape of it, the actual thing. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without demanding anything from it. The way he held most things, with a patience that wasn't passive but was simply very sure of itself. He wasn't asking for her story as currency. He wasn't asking so he could do something with it or hold it over her. He was asking because he was trying to understand what they were dealing with, and he needed to understand it completely. She told him. She started from the beginning because the beginning was the part that was hardest to explain, how Everett Crane had seemed initially like something she'd been lucky enough to find. He'd been charming in a way that was specific rather than general. He'd paid attention in a way that felt, at first, like being valued. She'd been 28 and alone, and trying to build a life on the proceeds of her father's modest estate. And she'd made the mistake that people make when they're tired of being careful. She'd let herself believe that what she wanted and what was true were the same thing. The engagement had been 6 months in when things started showing their actual shape. Not dramatically at first. Small things that she'd explained away. His anger at the waiter who'd gotten his order wrong. The particular tone he used when she said something he disagreed with in public. The way he'd taken her arm in a crowd. Not protectively, but possessively. Fingers tight in a way that left marks she'd told herself were accidental. The escalation was gradual enough that she'd been in the middle of it for a year before she'd stopped explaining things away and started seeing them for what they were. The kitchen door was not the worst thing. It wasn't even in the top 3. It was the thing she'd told herself would be the last thing, and she'd held to that. And she'd left on a Wednesday morning in borrowed clarity and walked into a future she hadn't built yet. She told Garrick all of it, or most of it. She left out the worst incident because some things she wasn't ready to put into words yet. Not because she was ashamed of them, she'd spent real effort getting clear of shame, but because they were hers, and she wasn't sure she wanted to give them to the room. Everything else she said plainly, in the order it happened, without editorial. Just the facts of it. Garrick listened without interrupting. She watched his face while she talked, not searching for a reaction, just observing what was there. His expression didn't do what she'd feared, didn't soften into pity or sharpen into the complicated look men sometimes got when they heard about another man's violence, the look that was half outrage and half something else she couldn't name but didn't like. His face stayed level. His eyes stayed on hers. He was paying attention in the specific way he paid attention to all things, completely, without performance. When she stopped talking, the silence lasted about 4 seconds. "All right," he said, just that. "All right." She looked at him. "All right," she repeated. "I mean, I understand now," he said, "what we're dealing with." He stood up and took his cup to the basin and rinsed it. His back was to her and she couldn't see his face, but she could read his posture, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate economy of movement that meant he was thinking hard about something. "He's not going to stop," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. And going further north just means he follows further north. Eventually, yes." He turned around. "Then running is the wrong strategy." He said it the same way he said most things, plainly, without softening it for comfort. You can keep running and he'll keep following, or you change the equation. She looked at him. "How?" "He's building a story," Garrick said. "A confused wife, concerned husband. That story works as long as you don't have one of your own, as long as there's nobody who knows you well enough to contradict what he says about you. He paused. You've been here 6 weeks. Henner knows who you are. I know. There are people in Coldwater Gulch who've seen you work and formed their own opinions. He pulled out the other chair and sat back down. If Everett Crane rides into this territory and his story runs into your actual life, his story gets complicated. She thought about that. You think that's enough? No, he said honestly. But it's something, and it buys time. He looked at her directly. What do you want to do when he gets here? Because he will get here. She'd thought about this in the sickbed. She'd thought about it longer than that. She'd thought about it in the chair in Garrick's cabin with the storm outside, and she'd thought about it in the narrow bed at Henner's with her boots on the floor. What she wanted and what was possible were 2 different maps, and she'd been trying to find the place where they overlapped. I want him to leave, she said, without me, and without being able to come back. What would make that happen? Witnesses, she said. People who've seen enough of me to know the story he's telling doesn't hold, and she stopped. This was the harder part. Documentation. If there are people here who can say who I am and that I came here of my own will and that I'm not confused and not his wife, that changes the legal shape of things. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it makes it harder for him to just take me. Garrick was quiet for a moment. I know a man, he said, in Coldwater Gulch. He's not exactly a lawyer, but he's close enough to know how to write things down in a way that counts. He drew up property agreements for the Caldwell operation, witness statements for a couple of disputes. He paused. I could talk to him. She looked at him. You'd do that? I already said we, he said. That wasn't a limited offer. She looked at the table. She thought about the word we and what it had cost her to accept it, and what it was costing him to extend it, and whether she was making a fair accounting of both sides. If he comes here, she said, it puts you in a position. He's got money, and he's got a hired man, and he will not be polite when he doesn't get what he wants. I need you to know that. Garrick looked at her with an expression that was patient to the point of being almost dry. Maeve, he said, I live alone on a mountain, and I run steel traps for a living. I'm not afraid of an unhappy man with a checkbook. She almost smiled. It came out more like an exhale, but it was close. Okay, she said. Talk to your man in Coldwater. He arrived on a Tuesday, which she knew because Henner was doing his accounts again, and the ledger was on the table, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her, that it began and very nearly ended on the same day of the week. She was in the yard splitting kindling, which Henner had tried to tell her was unnecessary, and which she'd done anyway because physical work was the best way she'd found to keep the anxiety flat, when she heard hooves on the track. 2 horses. She'd made a habit of listening for that, the particular sound of horses coming from the valley direction rather than the mountain direction. And she heard it now, and she felt the count of her heartbeats shift upward by exactly the amount she'd expected. She put the axe down. She didn't run inside. She made herself stand and watch the track. Everett Crane came around the tree line looking exactly like himself. That was the thing that hit her first. Not fear, or not only fear, but a kind of visceral recognition, the body remembering something the mind had been working to forget. He was well dressed even now, even on a mountain track in February. His coat was good wool, his horse was a bay with expensive tack, and he sat in the saddle with the effortless authority of a man who'd never been told he didn't belong somewhere. The man behind him was hired muscle, broad and blank-faced, and there to be large. Everett saw her. He stopped the horse. From 40 feet away she watched him take her in, her clothes, her boots, the axe handle in her hand. The fact that she was standing in a yard on a mountain and not running. She watched him recalibrate. He came the rest of the way at a walk. When he stopped, he looked down at her from horseback, which was deliberate. She understood the geometry of it, had experienced it many times. Maeve, he said. His voice was warm, publicly warm, the performance of concern. I've been so worried. Everett, she said, I've been looking for months. He dismounted, slowly, gracefully, because Everett did everything in a way that assumed an audience. He let the reins drop, knowing the horse was trained to stay, and he walked toward her with his hands open in a gesture of openness that she knew had nothing behind it. Let's go home. Whatever's happened, whatever you're... I'm not going anywhere with you, she said. He stopped. The warmth didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. She knew that shift, had learned to read the exact millisecond it happened. Sweetheart, don't, she said. The door of the trading post opened. Garrick came out. He didn't come out fast, didn't come out with anything in his hands, just came through the door and stood on the porch with his arms at his sides and his eyes on Everett. Henner was behind him in the doorway. Everett looked at Garrick. Garrick looked at Everett. The hired man on the second horse shifted his weight. Who are you? Everett said. Still controlled, still using the public voice. I live on this range, Garrick said, not answering the question exactly, just establishing presence. Everett turned back to Maeve. He'd made his assessment of Garrick in about 4 seconds, and she watched him decide that the assessment was in his favor. Garrick was bigger, but big wasn't the same as connected, and Everett had always bet on money over muscle. Maeve, you need to come with me. You're not well. Anyone who knows you can see... That's interesting, said Henner from the doorway. Because I've known her 6 weeks, and she seems perfectly clear-headed to me. Everett's eyes moved to Henner. And you are? The man she works for, Henner said. Legally employed since the 6th of December, wages paid as agreed, work done as promised. I've got the ledger inside if you want to see it. He said it the way he said everything, bluntly, without performance. She's not confused. She's not your wife. She's my employee. Everett was quiet for a moment. She watched him recalibrate again, more significantly this time. The story he'd been telling, confused wife, concerned husband, had run into exactly what Garrick had said it would run into. Her actual life. She's my fiancée, Everett said, correcting, smoothing, finding the new angle. I ended the engagement when I left, Maeve said. I think you know that. You weren't in a state to... There's also this, Garrick said. He came down from the porch and crossed the yard and held out a folded paper to Everett. Everett took it with the controlled expression of a man who didn't want to show anything. Maeve knew what it was. She'd signed it 4 days ago in Coldwater Gulch, in front of Garrick's man and 2 witnesses, a sworn statement of her own identity, her own volition, her own account of why she'd left and what she'd left. It named Everett Crane. It named dates. It named specifics. It was written in the careful, legally weighted language of someone who understood that paper held more permanence than words. Everett read it. She watched his face while he did. When he finished, he folded it and held it back out. Garrick didn't take it. That's a copy, Garrick said. The original's in Coldwater. The man who wrote it keeps copies of everything he draws up. It's how he works. The yard was very quiet. The hired man on the second horse had gone still in the way men go still when they're reassessing their own situation. Everett looked at Maeve. The warmth was gone from his face now, not replaced with anger, which would have been easier to navigate, but with something colder, something that was trying to do arithmetic and not finding numbers it liked. You've made a mistake, he said quietly, for her alone. I made a mistake 3 years ago, she said. This isn't one. He stood there for a moment longer. The hired man's horse shifted, and the small sound of it seemed to be what broke the stillness. Everett folded the paper again precisely and put it inside his coat. He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted it with the same controlled grace he'd arrived with. Not one motion wasted, not one thing given away. He pulled the horse's head around. This isn't finished, he said. It is, Garrick said. His voice was level and entirely certain. There's nothing here for you. The mountain's long and the winters are hard and the people in this territory have good memories. Whatever you're thinking about coming back, don't. Everett looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Maeve one more time. She held his gaze until he looked away. He rode out. The hired man followed. She watched them go until the trees closed behind them and the sound of hooves thinned and then disappeared, and the yard was silent except for the wind. She stood still. Her heartbeat was still elevated and her hands were less steady than she wanted them to be, and she was not going to pretend that it hadn't mattered, that some years of her life hadn't just stood in that yard and looked at her. But she was standing. She was standing in a yard on a mountain with her feet in a dead woman's boots and an axe handle in her right hand, and he was gone. She heard Garrick come up beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, the same way he'd stood in every situation that required presence rather than action. She exhaled. He'll go, Garrick said. Men like that, they go where it's easier. You've made it not easy. You don't know that for certain, she said. No, he said, but I know this territory, and I know the people in it, and they know me. He'd have to go through all of that to get to you, and it won't look the way he needs it to look. He paused. He'll go. She looked at the tree line where they'd disappeared. Okay, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Henner appeared from the porch. Coffee, he said, which was his way of saying most things, and went back inside. She looked at Garrick. He looked at her. There was something in the moment that didn't need filling with words, and neither of them tried. She put the axe back against the chopping block, and they went inside. Everett Crane did not come back. She waited for him to. That was the honest truth of the weeks that followed. She did the work, she ate her meals, she moved through the days with competence and purpose, and underneath all of it, she was waiting, not paralyzed by it, not defined by it, but waiting the way you wait for a sound you thought you heard in the dark, ear tilted toward it, not fully convinced the quiet means what it seems to mean. Garrick had said men like that go where it's easier. She'd held that statement up to the light from different angles, looking for the places where it might be wrong. The thing about Everett was that he was persistent when his pride was involved, and she'd hurt his pride by leaving, and then she'd hurt it further by standing in a yard on a mountain and not flinching. She knew him well enough to know that cost him something real. But Garrick also knew something she was still learning, that a man like Everett operated on the principle of favorable odds. He calculated. He planned. He didn't spend resources on battles he couldn't win in a way that served him publicly, and what Maeve had done, the sworn statement, the witnesses, Henner's ledger, the clear-eyed faces of people in Coldwater Gulch who knew her name and her work, had changed the odds on him in a territory where he had no existing influence. His story didn't fit the facts on the ground, and Everett, above all things, needed his story to fit. By March, she'd stopped sleeping with her boots beside the bed. She noticed the moment she did it, set them under the shelf where she'd originally kept them, the normal place, and stood back and looked at them sitting there and felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't fully known was tight. It was a small thing. It mattered. Spring came to the mountain the way it always does at altitude, reluctantly, in increments, 2 steps forward and 1 cold snap back. She'd been at Henner's 3 months by then, and she knew the rhythm of the trading post well enough to anticipate its needs rather than just respond to them. She'd reorganized the inventory twice now, the second time better than the first because she understood the logic of Henner's trade patterns, which seasons bought which goods, which camps ran short of what. She'd suggested he stock more medicinal supplies. She'd thought about the plant book, about yarrow and willow bark, and what it had meant to have them available, and Henner had considered it for about 30 seconds and said fine, and the medicinal supplies had sold through by February. Henner was not a warm man, and he never became one. But there was an afternoon in late February when he came in from the yard and set a pair of work gloves on the table in front of her without explanation, good ones, calfskin, properly fitted, and went into the back room, and she understood that this was how Henner said the things he didn't say directly. She wore the gloves. They fit correctly, which meant he'd paid attention to her hands, and that was its own kind of thing. Garrick came by twice a week, sometimes 3 times. The visits had a shape to them now. He'd arrive, usually with something practical that provided a reason, sometimes with nothing at all and no particular explanation required. And they'd drink coffee and talk and occasionally work on something together, and he'd leave before dark. The conversations had deepened in the way of conversations between people who've stopped performing for each other and started just talking. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. Not the worst of Clearwater, she kept that still. Not out of shame, but out of the sense that some experiences needed time to become language, needed to be metabolized into something she could hand over without it still being raw. But other things. Her father, who'd been a difficult man and a good teacher and had died when she was 23 and left her more alone than she'd anticipated. The life she'd been trying to build in Reader's Crossing before Everett, which had been modest and imperfect and entirely hers. The way she'd felt, walking out the front door of the house on Clearwater Road with 1 bag, like the ground might not hold. He told her things too, not easily. He wasn't built for easy disclosure, but consistently. The way water finds its level over time. His family in the East, a brother he'd lost track of, a father whose opinion he'd spent his 20s trying to stop caring about. The canyon with the old drawings, which he described in more detail one evening until she could see it clearly enough that it felt like a place she'd been. The The first winter he'd spent up here alone, which had been harder than he'd expected, in which he'd survived mostly through stubbornness, which he said without pride or false modesty, just as information. She didn't know exactly when she understood what she felt about him. It wasn't one moment. It was accumulated. The way a waterline rises, no single drop responsible for the level. She knew it clearly on an afternoon in March when he was helping her move a heavy shelf unit in the storage room, and they were both pushing from the same side, and he was closer than usual, and she was acutely aware of the specific warmth of him, the particular solidity, and she thought with a plainness that surprised her. I don't want him to leave. Not for the afternoon, not for any of the afternoons. She wanted him to stay, in the specific, permanent, irrevocable sense that she'd avoided wanting anything in that register for 3 years because wanting things in that register had cost her. She didn't say it. Not then. The shelf got moved. He stayed for supper. He left before dark. She stood on Henner's porch and watched the horse carry him up the track and thought about the canyon with the old drawings, about summer, about a word he'd used that might have been a promise. It was the first week of April when he came with the wagon. She saw it before she understood what it meant. The gray mare in harness instead of under saddle, the flatbed behind it, a canvas tied over something she couldn't immediately identify. He came into the yard and stopped and swung down, and she came out of the trading post drying her hands on her apron and looked at the wagon and then at him. "What is this?" she said. "I've been building something," he said. He untied one corner of the canvas. Underneath were wooden frames, window frames, she realized, 2 of them, fitted with real glass, which was not cheap and not easy to get up here, and which represented a significant decision on someone's part. "The cabin needs a second window. The east wall's been solid since I built it, and the light's not good in the mornings." She looked at the window frames. She looked at him. "A second window," she said. "And the storage bunk needs to come down," he said, not looking at her. "It's wasted space. If it came down, there'd be room for a proper table. Bigger than the one I've got." He retied the canvas corner. "I've also been thinking the porch extension could go all the way around the north side. It would—" "Garrick," she said. He stopped. She waited until he looked at her. "What are you building?" she said. "Not about the window, about all of it." He held her gaze with the directness that was his most fundamental quality, the thing about him she'd trusted first before she'd trusted anything else. "Something worth staying in," he said, "if a person wanted to stay in it." The yard was quiet. A bird somewhere in the tree line was doing something optimistic about spring. "That's not a clear question," she said. She needed him to say it clearly. Not because she didn't understand him, she understood him completely, but because she'd had things implied at her and assumed at her, and decided for her without her consent, and she needed, this once, to hear the actual words. He understood that. She saw him understand it. "I want you to come back to the cabin," he said. "Not as a guest, not as someone waiting for the next thing. Permanently, as—" He paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked slightly less than certain, and that slight uncertainty was the most honest thing she'd ever seen on his face. "As whoever that is, whatever that looks like. I don't have fancy words for it. I know it's a hard life, and I know the winters are long, and I know I'm not easy to be around all the time." "You're not that hard to be around," she said. "I'm told otherwise." "By who? You don't talk to anyone." Something almost cracked in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the place where a smile came from. "There's a good table in that cabin," he said. "Better than what's at Henner's. And the east window? We'll let in the morning light," she said. "Yes." She looked at the wagon. The window frames under the canvas, the glass that had been carried up a mountain road in February, the evidence of a decision made carefully and without announcement, because that was how he made all his decisions. She thought about the dried apples and the second-hand boots and the chair beside the sickbed, and 2 days he'd sat in it without being asked and without keeping a tab. She thought about being 31 years old and standing at the edge of something real. "Henner will need someone," she said. "I know. I thought, there's a woman in Coldwater who's been looking for work since her husband went to the Caldwell camp. She's capable. I can mention it to Henner if you want." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since January," he said, which was not a small admission, and he knew it, and made it anyway. She stood in the yard of the trading post on an April morning with mud on her boots from the spring thaw and her hair not properly arranged and her hands still damp from the dishwater. And she thought about all the versions of her future she'd mapped out in the dark, and how none of them had looked like this. Not because this was worse than what she'd imagined, because it was so specifically different, so particular, so unplanned, so much a product of a blizzard, and a man who'd noticed her dying in a street and made a simple offer without requiring anything back. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "I'll come back," she said. "No, not right away. I'll talk to Henner. I'll find him someone. I'll do it right. But yes." She met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't need him to, and neither of them reached for more words than the situation required, which was the most comfortable she'd felt inside a moment in longer than she could accurately remember. She talked to Henner that evening. She sat across from him at the table after supper with her coffee and said she was going to leave at the end of the month, and she told him about the woman in Coldwater, and she said she was sorry for the short notice, even though a month wasn't short notice by any reasonable measure. Henner listened with his usual flat attention, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That man," he said finally, meaning Garrick. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "He's steady," Henner said. He said it as if it were a complete sentence, which it was. "I know," she said. "Good," he said, and got up and refilled his coffee, and that was the end of the conversation. But later that night, when she passed through the main room, she saw he'd put the gloves she'd left on the shelf back on the table where she'd find them in the morning, and she understood he was saying, "Take them. They're yours. You earned them." So she did. She moved back to this cabin on a Thursday at the end of April. She'd accumulated more than she'd arrived with, which was one of the things she noticed making the trip. A pack that was heavier, the gloves, a jar of Henner's preserved plums she'd put up in February, the plant book that Garrick had quietly put in her hands when she'd come back from the sickbed, and which she'd come to understand was not alone. A pair of work trousers she'd made herself from material Henner had traded for that turned out to not move through his regular customers. 3 books she'd bought in Coldwater with her own earned wages, which felt like a completely different thing than any book she'd ever owned before. The cabin looked different from the outside with the second window in the east wall, the glass catching the afternoon light and throwing it back clean. Garrick had also fixed the porch extension, which now ran along the north side as he'd described, a covered area wide enough to work under in bad weather. He'd built a second chair for the porch, which was sitting out there next to the first one, and the sight of 2 chairs side by side on a mountain porch hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting. She stood in the yard for a moment looking at it. "You gonna come in or just look at it?" Garrick said. He was in the doorway. "I'm looking," she said. "It's the window," he said, with a seriousness that was only partly performance. "Everyone looks at the window." She went inside. The storage bunk was gone, as promised. In its place was a table, larger than the original, real wood, fitted together with the careful joinery she'd come to recognize as his particular skill, the thing he did when the long evenings needed filling. The east window threw a rectangle of light across it that would be there every morning, and she stood in it for a moment and felt the light on her hands. There were 2 plates on the table, 2 cups. She looked at Garrick. "I made supper," he said. He looked slightly uncertain in the way she'd seen him look exactly once before, in the yard at Henner's, when he'd said permanently, "It's not complicated. It smells good," she said. He exhaled, moved to the stove. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, her peg, the one she'd used during the storm, and set her pack down and sat at the table, at the chair that faced the east window, and she looked out at the mountain going blue-gray in the fading afternoon. They ate supper. It wasn't complicated, salt pork and beans and cornbread, which was what she'd eaten the first night, which she thought might not be a coincidence. And they talked about the spring work that needed doing, the traps that needed moving to the summer lines, the state of the north track after the thaw. She told him about Henner's accounts and the patterns she'd noticed in the winter trade. He told her he'd seen bear sign on the ridge, which meant the winter had been good for them. Fat going in and fat coming out, which was its own kind of indicator. It was ordinary conversation, the most ordinary thing in the world. She sat across from him in the cabin that had window light now and thought that ordinary was what she'd been running toward, all those miles, all those months. Not excitement, not rescue, Just a table and a window and a person who told her things directly and asked nothing from her that she hadn't already agreed to give. She washed the dishes after and he dried them, which was a reversal of their original arrangement from the storm and which neither of them commented on. The lamp threw its even light over the room. Outside, the mountain was settling into the particular silence of a clear spring night, the kind that carries sounds farther than usual. Somewhere, something called once and went quiet. She put the last dish on the shelf and turned around. He was at the table, not carving this time, just sitting with his hands around his coffee cup. And he was looking at her with the expression that had no performance in it, no calculation, just looking. The way he looked at the canyon with the old drawings, the way he looked at things that mattered to him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. She'd been thinking about how to say it for a week. She'd tried several versions and rejected them all because they were too careful, too arranged, and what she wanted to say was not a careful thing. "Before I came here, I was someone who didn't believe—" She stopped, started differently. "I spent 3 years learning that people want things from you, that help cost something, that warmth is usually a transaction, and you just haven't found the price yet." She looked at him. "I came up the North Track in a blizzard because the alternative was dying, and I spent a long time waiting for the price." He didn't say anything. "It took me a long time to understand that you're not like that," she said. "Not because you're perfect, you're not. You're stubborn, and you don't explain yourself when you should, and you make decisions about things and present them as facts before you've asked a person what they think." A pause. "The window frames." The corner of his mouth moved. "You didn't complain about the window frames." "I'm complaining now," she said, retroactively. She held his eyes. "What I'm trying to say is, I don't know how to do this easily. I've forgotten, if I ever knew, but I want to try. With you. And I need you to know that's not nothing for me. That's about the biggest thing I've got." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw its light. The mountain breathed outside the windows. "I know," he said. He said it the same way he'd said all right after she told him about Clearwater, not as dismissal, but as full receipt. "I heard it. I understand the weight of it. I'm not putting it down." "I'm not easy either," he said. "I've been alone a long time and I've built habits around it that aren't all good. I'll get things wrong." "I know," she said. "But I'm not going anywhere," he said. It came out simply. The way he said things he meant entirely. "Whatever needs figuring out, we'll figure it out." There it was again. We. She'd stopped flinching at it sometime in February without noticing, and now she sat with it like something that fit correctly, like the boots. "Okay," she said. She crossed to the table and sat down across from him and picked up her own coffee cup, and they sat in the lamplight and finished their coffee, and the night came down over the mountain with the full authority of a thing that's been doing this for longer than anyone can remember. The summer came, and with it the canyon. He took her on a clear morning in late June when the wildflowers were doing their brief, unreasonable thing on the high slopes. She hadn't known the high country had wildflowers until she'd been there in summer, had assumed it was all rock and pine, and that was fine by her. And then June arrived, and she'd stood on the porch in the early morning and said out loud, to no one in particular, "Oh," and he'd heard it from inside and come to the door and looked at where she was looking, and she could see he was pleased in the private way he was pleased by things. The canyon was everything he'd said it was. They went down the east wall path, narrow, loose-footed, requiring her full attention in the places where the drop was serious, and at the bottom the stream ran cold and clear exactly as he'd described, and the cave drawings were on the east wall where the afternoon light hit them best. She stood in front of them for a long time. Animals, yes, and shapes she couldn't fully read, patterns that suggested something without resolving into certainty. Hands. Several hands, outlined in red pigment, smaller than she expected. "How old?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Old." She reached out and held her own hand near one of the outlined ones without touching. Her hand was larger, slightly, or about the same. It was hard to tell. She thought about the person who'd stood here and pressed their hand to stone and left a mark that was still here after however many generations. She thought about what it meant to want to leave a mark, to say I was here. I existed. This is the shape of my hand. She understood it completely. She looked at Garrick, standing beside her in the shadow of the canyon wall, and she thought, this is the shape of my life now. This is what I found at the end of the running. Not safety exactly. Nothing in the mountains was safe, she'd learned that thoroughly, but something more durable than safety. Someone who'd stood in a blizzard and made a plain offer and had never, not once, asked for more than she'd agreed to give. She took his hand, not the outlined one on the wall, his actual hand standing beside her, which was rough from work and warm from the summer air, and familiar to her now in the way of things that have become part of your daily texture. He didn't say anything. He closed his hand around hers, and they stood in the canyon looking at the drawings, and the stream ran at the bottom, and the light was doing what it does at altitude in the long summer afternoons. By the time the first snow came to the peaks again, the cabin had changed enough that it no longer looked like it belonged to one person. It was small things, accumulated. A second row of hooks by the door, her books on the shelf beside his, the spines a different mix of worn and new. A drying rack she'd built herself, badly at first, and then less badly on the second attempt, for the herbs she'd been collecting from the plant book's instructions. A piece of red calico tacked over the east window for the rare mornings when the light was too much, which she'd put up without asking and which he'd looked at once and said nothing about, which meant fine. Garrick was still stubborn. She was still not naturally easy about receiving help and had to work at it consciously, which she didn't always manage. He still made decisions too fast, and she still went quiet when she should say the thing out loud, and there were evenings when they were both tired and the edges showed, and the edges were sharp because neither of them was a smooth person, and they'd both stopped pretending to be. But the fire was kept. The food was on the table. The work was shared in the natural way of two people who've stopped thinking about division and just do what the day requires. And on the nights when the winter came down hard and the cabin creaked against it and the fire was the whole world, they sat on opposite sides of it and were warm and were not alone. And that was not a small thing. That was in fact the thing. Maeve Holloway had walked into a blizzard with 43 cents and the specific determination of someone who'd run out of other options, and what she'd found on the other side of it wasn't a rescue. No one had saved her. She'd made every choice that mattered, to follow a stranger up a mountain, to work, to stay, to speak, to stand in a yard and not flinch. She'd built the life herself, piece by piece, the way you build anything that's worth having, without a clean plan, with more difficulty than you'd prefer, with imperfect materials and uncertain weather and no guarantee of outcome. She'd learned that survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just getting up and making breakfast and doing the work and being honest and not leaving when things are hard. Sometimes the bravest thing is staying. Sometimes the thing you find at the end of the running is a table and a window and someone who means what they say. Sometimes the mountain that looked like the end of everything turns out to be the beginning of the only life that ever actually fit. The snow came down over the peaks, even and white and complete, the same as it always had. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned. 2 cups on the table, the east window holding the last of the afternoon light before the dark came, and the fire took over and the mountains settled in around them for another long winter that they would face, as they faced everything now, together.